بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله أما بعد فإن أحسن الكلام كلام الله وخير الهدى هدى محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم وإن شر الأمور محدثاتها وكل محدثة بدعة وكل بدعة ضلالة وكل ضلالة في النار. So my lecture today is on the sects and how to study the sects, to know the sects, the deviant sects, and the aim and the objective, or the main aim of the objective, is obviously to avoid their misguidance, to know their misguidance and to avoid their misguidance. So in this lecture, there's a lot of material to get through, and obviously the topic cannot be done justice in the period of an hour or so. So I'm going to try to cover and make the most relevant and pertinent points and give the listener, inshallah, maybe a broad idea as to how you would expand your knowledge of the sects and the deviations that they entered into, and how to organize that study. So what I'm going to do first is mention that which we know from the Quran and the Sunnah of the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So this is really the first point to establish, which is that Allah Azza wa Jal and His Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam have informed us of a reality that is going to unfold with respect to this ummah, this nation, and that this nation would follow in the footsteps of previous nations, and that they would split and that they would divide, that they would leave the guidance. Amongst them would be those who would leave the guidance. All of this is an actual reality from the knowledge of the unseen, that the Messenger of Allah was informed, and the foundations of which we can find in the Quran very clearly. So of the many ayat that could be mentioned, I will mention just only a small number of them for the sake of brevity, is, for example, the statement of Allah Azza wa Jal at the beginning of Surah Ali Imran, the ayah, هو الذي أنزل عليك الكتاب منه آيات محكمات هن الكتاب وأخر متشابهات. So this is the ayah that speaks about the revelation of the Quran, and that it comprises very clear, decisive verses, and other verses which are more ambiguous in their meaning. And the verse continues to say how there will be found those people in whose hearts is a deviation and a desire for deviation. They will pursue the ambiguous, seeking fitna, seeking tribulation, seeking to make these interpretations. So this is very clear. And when we go back to the books of tafsir and the statements of the Sahaba and the Tabi'een, then you will see that they will make remarks that this refers to the Ahlul Ahwa, the people of desires and the people of innovations. So here is a very clear indicator. Similarly, the statement of Allah Azza wa Jal, وَأَنَّ هَذَا صِرَاطِي مُسْتَقِيمًا فَاتَّبِعُوهُ وَلَا تَتَّبِعُوا السُّبُلَ فَتَفَرَّقَ بِكُمْ عَنْ سَبِيلِهِ. Say this is my and that this is my straight path, and that this is my straight path, so follow it, and do not follow the other paths, lest they separate you from His path. And once more, this verse is elaborated upon in the Sunnah, and likewise we find statements from the Salaf applying this verse to the people of innovations and misguidance. Likewise, a very clear command from Allah Azza wa Jal, وَلَا تَكُونُوا كَالَّذِينَ تَفَرَّقُوا وَاخْتَلَفُوا مِنْ بَعْدِ مَا جَاءَهُمُ الْبَيِّنَاتِ. Do not be like those who split and differed after the clear evidences came to them. And similarly, the statement of Allah Azza wa Jal in Surah Al-Anfal, Ya ayyuha alladhina amanu, ati'u Allah wa rasulah, wa la tawallaw anhu wa antum tasma'un. O you who believe, obey Allah and His Messenger, and do not turn away from Him while you are listening. Do not turn your back on Him while you are listening to Him. So this is an ayah that mentions the obedience to the Messenger of Allah and to listen to him and to attend to him, and that there can be a trait amongst the people where despite them hearing him, they turn away from him. So this would apply to the firaq, the sects who know the Messenger of Allah, they listen to his speech, yet they turn away, meaning that they turn away in the matter of guidance and misguidance and deviation and so on and so forth. So all of this is very clear and apparent. And likewise in the Sunnah, many ahadith we know that relate to this topic. The most famous of them, the hadith of the splitting of the ummah, just like the Jews and the Christians split before the Muslims. And likewise the statement of the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, أما بعد فإن خير الحديث كتاب الله وخير الهدى هدى محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم. Just like we mentioned at the beginning, indeed the best speech is the book of Allah, the best guidance is the guidance of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and the worst of affairs, the most evil of affairs are the newly introduced affairs, the novelties. And every novelty is an innovation, and every innovation is misguidance. And in another narration, all misguidance is in the hellfire. Man raghiba an sunnati falaysa minni. Whoever aspires away from my sunnah, who leaves my sunnah, he is not from me. And likewise the hadith of Al-Irbad about whoever lives for long, فَإِنَّهُ مَنْ يَعِشْ مِنْكُمْ فَسِيرَ اخْتِلَافًا كَثِيرًا فَعَلَيْكُمْ بِسُنَّتِي وَسُنَّةِ الْخُلَفَاءِ الرَّاشِدِينَ الْمَهْدِيِّينَ. That whoever amongst you lives for long, he will see great controversies. So upon you is to stick to my sunnah and the sunnah of the rightly guided khulafa. And similarly, again, many statements from the salaf, from the sahaba and from the salaf, speaking along similar lines. Ibn Mas'ud radiyallahu anhu, ittabi'u wa la tabtadi'u faqad kufitum kulla dalalah. Follow and do not innovate, for indeed you have been sufficed away from every misguidance. That whatever you have been given, there's enough in that for you to be sufficed from all misguidance. And similarly, Ibn Abbas radiyallahu anhuma, alikum bil istiqamah wal athar wa iyakum wat tabaddu'. Upon you is to remain upright upon this guidance, and upon the narration, the athar, and beware of innovating. And similarly, Ayyub as-Sakhtiyani, مَزْدَادَ صَاحِبُ بِدْعَةٍ اجْتِهَادًا إِلَّا ازْدَادَ مِنَ اللَّهِ بُعْدًا. Never does a person of innovation increase in his dedication, in his efforts, in his innovation, except that he increases in his distance from Allah Azza wa Jal. So these are just a very quick sample of statements, and what we want to derive from these things, first of all, is the fact that Allah Azza wa Jal in the Quran and His Messenger have informed us about an unfolding reality that is going to happen in the Ummah. And in fact also one verse I forgot to mention in Surah Hud, وَلَا يَزَالُونَ مُخْتَلِفِينَ إِلَّا مَنْ رَحِمَ رَبُّكَ. They will not cease to differ, to be in variation, except those upon whom your Lord shows mercy. And so some of the commentators like Mujahid rahimahullah, he said وَلَا يَزَالُونَ مُخْتَلِفِينَ, meaning أهل الباطل, the people of falsehood, إِلَّا مَنْ رَحِمَ رَبُّكَ, meaning أهل الحق ليس فيهم اختلاف, the people of truth, and there is no difference between them, meaning they do not differ in the usul, in the foundations of the religion. They are united upon that. So this we have been told about, and Allah speaks the truth, the Messenger speaks the truth, and the Messenger of Allah, he also mentions some of these groups by description or by name, like the Khawarij and the Qadariyah. So all of this is something undeniable. It is undeniable. So this is really the first point that we want to make. And this is because there are to be found people in the modern era, in the modern time, in the 20th century, and in fact in the 19th and in the 20th and now in the 21st century, who come along and they want to ignore this reality. And they want to ignore the fact that it is this very splitting and differing is the cause of weakness and is the cause of increased humiliation and, a lot of confusion. And this is a hindrance to the hearts of the people. All of this hinders the hearts of the people from receiving that pure revelation and being nurtured upon that pure guidance. So therefore, any Muslim who wants to be upon right guidance, he must pay attention to this affair. And obviously, this whole topic is connected to the topic of Aqidah. So there was an earlier lecture yesterday by Sheikh Abu Khadija, Hafidhahullah, and he discussed this topic, how to study the Aqidah. And really this topic, my topic today, is inseparable from that topic. And that's because as you study the creed, inevitably you are going to come across the groups that deviated from that creed. So when you go to the source books of Aqidah that you study, then inevitably you are going to come across mention of these sects or mention of their deviant viewpoints. So this topic today of knowing the sects and knowing their misguidance, this is a branch and it is connected to the topic of Aqidah. And so, inevitably when you study one, you are going to have to study the other. They are both inseparable. So after this first point, the second point we need to know and understand is the benefits and the objectives behind the study of these sects. And when we understand the benefits and the objectives, then obviously it shows the importance of this topic in general. So there are numerous points that can be made. First of all, we study the sects in order to know the actual causes, the reasons that led them to fall into their misguidance, right? So this is the first reason. It is to know the causes, the asbab. What are the causes? What are the reasons why they fell into that particular deviation? And this itself can branch off into numerous other possibilities. Sometimes there are historical events. There are historical events that explain why this deviation happened. And this is very clear with respect to the Khawarij and the Rafidah. So there's a reaction to an event. And other times there can be, foreign influences, external influences that have come upon a person or a group of people. And this, of course, is very clear with people like Al-Ja'ad bin Dirham and Jahm bin Safwan and others. Other times it can be people abandoning the people of knowledge, right? So the true people of knowledge who took knowledge from the Sahaba, who are grounded, and then you find that these people abandon them and rely upon their own opinions, right? So this now is a type of jahl and reliance upon opinion. So an example of this would be Wasil bin Ata, who abandoned, the gatherings of the people of knowledge in his time. And it went on to, lead to the statement of the Mu'tazila and the deviation of the Mu'tazila, right? So the first reason why we study is that we want to know what were the actual causes that led them to go astray. We want to identify what the reasons are, because we want to avoid that. Just like Hudhayfa bin al-Yaman radiyallahu anhu used to, say that the people used to ask the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam anil khair, about goodness, and I used to ask him about evil. Wa kuntu as'aluhu anil shar, fearing that it might reach me. So we want to know what are the reasons and the causes that made these people to fall into the deviation, right? So this is reason number one. The second reason is that we want to explain the futility, the falsehood of what they are upon, whether it is a matter of belief or whether it is, something like an innovated act of worship. And in doing so, we are protecting the creed, we are protecting the religion, we are protecting the Sharia from that these foreign alien beliefs or doctrines or acts of worship are ascribed to the Sharia, and thereby the Sharia undergoes tabdeel and tahrif, alteration, distortion, just as the legislations of previous nation, it happened to previous nations, like the Jews, like the Christians. So the second reason why it is important to know and study the sects, the deviant sects, is to falsify and invalidate their false beliefs and acts of worship, and to protect the religion, its creed, its legislation, its Sharia. And similarly, that we protect the Muslims in general from the deviations that, they may possibly fall into. So that now is the second reason, and that is protection, preservation of Allah's religion and preservation of the hearts of His servants. The third reason is to have a sound, solid understanding of the creed of Ahlul Sunnati wal Jama'ah. And only when you know the opposing statements, as the poet said, and as Hudhayfa bin al-Yaman said as well, that he used to ask the people, he used to ask the Prophet ﷺ about the evil in order to avoid it. And similarly, as we find in the statement of poetry, وَبِضِدِّهَا تَتَبَيِّنُ الْأَشْيَاء. And by their opposites are the realities of things known, right? So when you have a statement of truth, there's also a statement of falsehood. And that statement of falsehood could also take on many forms. And when you know that statement of falsehood, it increases your understanding, your grasp of the statement of truth. So one of the other reasons is, and one of the main important reasons, is that it increases our insight and our knowledge of the Aqidah of Ahlul Sunnati wal Jama'ah. And it increases our insight and our understanding, and we become more firmly rooted in the sound creed when we know in detail what opposes it. So this is a very important objective. This is the third objective. And the fourth objective is that unless we know the statements that are statements of deviation and what their level is, then we need to be able to give the correct ruling. We need to be able to give the correct ruling to an individual and his statements, his doctrines, and likewise to the group as a whole. If there's a group which has emerged, if there's a sect which has emerged, and we need to be able to pass the proper judgment upon the individuals and groups and sects. So it's to arrive at the correct Sharia ruling on them, and therefore how they are interacted with, because then there are other rulings and consequences that come from that as well. And so in some instances, the bid'ah, the innovation, the deviation could be, in fact, a statement of disbelief. And sometimes it might just be, a mistake and a deviation. It does not reach the level of disbelief. And so there are implications that follow on from that. And so therefore, a detailed study is necessary in order to pass the correct ruling upon individuals, groups and parties, and then therefore our interaction with them is also made clear thereby, because we want to make sure that we are established upon justice, that we abide by justice, and that we do not fall short, nor do we fall into excess, into exaggeration when it comes to ascribing statements and then passing rulings, and then in terms of how we behave and interact, right? So these are 4 things that we've mentioned for reasons that collectively they show the importance of knowing and studying the various groups and sects. So in essence, in summary, first of all, we want to take an admonition for ourselves to not to follow in the same footsteps by learning about the sects and the groups. Secondly, we want to be able to protect the religion from being distorted and from false things being ascribed to it. Thirdly, we want to be able to have a solid understanding of the true creed and therefore be able to give da'wah upon clarity. Right? We are able, because out there in the field, there are all of these statements, opinions, deviations, misunderstandings, and so on and so forth. People carry them and people promote them and speak with them. So by studying the sects and the groups, we have a better grasp of the sunnah, of the creed, and therefore we are able to call to Allah, upon basira, upon insight, and we are able to spread the sunnah thereby. And fourthly, we are able to pass the correct judgment, an accurate judgment upon the various sects and upon the individuals, and we are very clear in terms of how we ought to behave with them. So this is the second main overall point that I want to make in my lecture. The first one obviously was to establish from the ayat of the Quran and from the sunnah of the Messenger of Allah and from the athar that this is an undeniable reality about the splitting and deviation. And the second main point was the importance of this knowledge in terms of what are some of the objectives behind it. And so now we come to part 3 or point 3 of my lecture. And this now is more like a method. How do you increase your knowledge? How do you build your knowledge about the various groups and the sects? And the best way to do this, or like one approach and one way to do this, because obviously we have to be practical and we have to, act in accordance with the realities, which is that there is just too much information and it is not relevant to every person, and it is too much to grasp, at any one time, and no one has the time and the resources to be able to sit and learn everything about every, historical deviant and historical sect. And also, this isn't something, like I said, this is a branch of Aqidah. This is something that you study inevitably while you are studying the topic of Aqidah in its various, in the various subject areas or in the various books. So we have to be aware of this reality, right? That you can't just dedicate all your time, and study every sect, every individual, every deviation, every, statement of heresy. It's just not practical. So therefore, there's a method that you have to lay down so that over time, systematically, as time progresses, you are gradually building your knowledge of, a particular sect, a particular deviation. And so you need to organize yourself and your activities to be able to manage this study over time, right? So this is what I'm going to present in, what is to follow in, the rest of this lecture. Inshallah, if we have time to complete all of this. So what we need to do first of all is we need to first of all have a broad bird's eye view of history and a basic idea of the key innovations or the key sects which appeared and at what time they appeared, right? We need to have just a broad understanding and a broad idea. So we've got we've got a map. You create a map, right? So you've got 1st century Hijrah, 2nd century Hijrah, 3rd century Hijrah, 4th century, 5th, 6th, 7th. And so for the purpose of this lecture, I'm going to concentrate really just on the first 5 or 6 centuries, basically before the time of Shaykh al-Islam Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah, the 7th centuries. And we have a basic idea of what are the sects or the groups or the orientations that we need to be aware of. So we need to first of all build this kind of bird's eye picture of all of that. So to help us do that, I'm going to start with the statement of Yusuf bin Asbat rahimahullah ta'ala, one of the Salaf in the, at the end of the 2nd century Hijrah. And it is related from him by Al-Ajuri and others that he said, Usulul bid'ah arba'a, al-Rawafid, wal-Khawarij, wal-Qadariyah, wal-Murji'ah. The foundations of innovation are 4. They are the Rawafid, the Rafidah, the Khawarij, the Qadariyah, and the Murji'ah. So these now are the 4 major sects which appeared in the 1st century Hijrah, right? So these are the usul, these are the foundations. And each of these innovations, so basically what you would do is you take a series of notebooks, right, of average size, maybe, 40 sheets, 60 sheets, 80 sheets. You get these notebooks and they have a particular, thickness, right? They're different sizes. So you take a notebook and one book will be for the Khawarij. One book will be for the Rafidah. One book will be for the Qadariyah. And one book will be for the Murji'ah, right? So now you have 4 books and you label them. Khawarij, Rafidah, Qadariyah, Murji'ah. And so what you will do in each of these books, over time, you are going to slowly build your knowledge along the following pieces of information, right? You are going to put in there, whenever this, as I said, you can't just sit down and do this all in one go. This is something that happens over time. So over time, as you are engaged in your general studies and as you attend lessons and as you attend lectures, and even sometimes you may even choose a particular book to read, a historical book, and as you're reading, you come across certain things. Every time you come across something, a relevant piece of information, then you put it in that book. So the things that you are looking for, these are the things that you would be looking for. First of all, the names of the men, the name of the originator, or the, because sometimes you have many figureheads within a sect or a group. So you need to find out, okay, who is the original person, right? So by way of example, you have Al-Ja'ad bin Dirham, right, for the Jahmiyyah, and you have Wasil bin Ata and Amr bin Ubaid at the beginning of the 2nd century, right? So this is the first piece of information that you want to collect. You want to know the name of the key figureheads, the key people. The second thing that you want to make a note of is, what are the issues of dispute? Like, what's the actual issue here? What's the concept or the idea that they went astray in? And I'm going to give some examples, inshallah, in shortly, inshallah ta'ala, to give some examples of what we mean by this. But before we do, let me just mention the rest of these pieces of information. So you're looking at, first of all, the names of the men. You're looking at what is the idea, the topic that they went astray in. Thirdly, what are the evidences or the misinterpretations, right? So what are the texts? What's the Quranic verse or the verses? What's the hadith? What are they using that they've actually misunderstood? And fourthly, what is the effect of this idea or this innovation? What are the consequences? How have the scholars and the people of knowledge, how did they? So basically, you are looking to gather all of this information and to put it in this book for each of these groups. In this case, we are looking at the first century, the Khawarij, the Rafida, the Qadariyah, the Murji'ah. Also, you are looking to put the names of any kind of subgroups, right? Because you know that even amongst these groups, like the Rafida, there are many subgroups. There are the Khawarij, there are many subgroups, right? So you also are going to put the names of subgroups and the figureheads of those subgroups, and why did they split? And I'm going to give you, inshallah, if there's enough time, just like an illustration with the Khawarij. Right. So let's make sure that we all clearly understand then. So the first point is, we need to have a bird's eye view of the various centuries and which groups appeared in what centuries. We've started with the first century, Hijrah, the Khawarij, Rafida, Qadariyah, and the Murji'ah. The Khawarij and the Rafida, in fact, let me explain. They are connected to the issue of the Sahaba and rulership and leadership, right? So this is the issue. This is the idea around which their innovation revolves. And obviously also the sinful people, the ones who commit, sins, that's also another issue as well. So we have 4 books that we are going to use for our future information gathering and information collection, and then we are going to write these details down in these books, and over time obviously we are going to revise it and restructure it and change it around and try to make it meaningful to us, in order to aid comprehension. So the things that we are looking for over time is the names of men and when they died, or roughly which era they were in. The issues, what are the actual issues? Now let me give you what I mean here. Let me go through a number of sects. So for example, let's take the Khawarij and the Murji'ah. What's really the central issue that is affected by their innovation? Well, it's something that we call al-asma wal-ahkam. Al-asma wal-ahkam. This is to do with what label do we put on someone, right? A sinful person among the Muslims, what's the label we give to him? Is it kafir? Is it mu'min? Is it Muslim? Is it mu'min naqisul iman? A believer deficient in iman? So this is to do, the bid'ah of the Khawarij and the Murji'ah is to do with the labels that we put on a Muslim or a believer, right? So for example, the Murji, he will say about a sinful person, he is a mu'min kamilul iman, a believer who is complete in his iman. But this is incorrect. This is false. This is not true. A person who commits major sins cannot be complete in his belief. But this is a mistake of the Murji'ah. And the Khawarij, they say a person who commits a major sin is a kafir, a disbeliever. And he is, he will remain eternally in the hellfire. This is now a judgment that they've passed upon this person. This judgment is wrong. So here in the case of the Khawarij and the Murji'ah, what is the real central issue that we are trying to resolve? That we are trying to, resolve. It is the issue of labels and names that we give to people and the rulings that apply to them. Because as you know, in Islam, there are many rulings. There is the ruling of Islam, and then there is the ruling of Iman, and the ruling of Ihsan, right? Then there is the ruling of Kufr, and Shirk, and Nifaq. And so we have a Muslim, Mu'min, Muhsin, and Mushrik, Kafir, Munafiq, right? These are all rulings. So we need to be very, very clear that we apply the right labels and the right rulings upon people. Otherwise, there will be oppression, and there will be either exaggeration or there will be neglect, as we see in the case of the Murji'ah, right? So this is the real issue that we are trying to solve. So my point being that as you study these sects and you write things in these books, you have to try to grasp what is the central issue here that we are trying to resolve, around which the innovations of these groups, or this group, around which it revolves. Let me give you a second example, a very easy example, which is to do with the issue of the Sahaba radiallahu anhum and the Khawarij and the Rafida. Well, this is the issue of al-imama was Sahaba, the issue of leadership and rulership, and the whole issue to do with the companions and their status in the religion and their status as carriers and conveyors of the revelation. What is their status? How do we speak about them? And the issues of rulership, the khilafah, and how the leadership is acquired, and so on and so forth. This is the central issue that we need to understand, and then we need to find the answers. We need to be clear about the answers from the Sunnah and how these people went astray. So here, for example, this would be relevant to the Khawarij first of all, and then to the various groups of the Shia, the Rafida, and all the various groups, the Zaydiyya, the Ismailiyya, Duruz, and so on and so forth, right? And this, when we understand, we can see the nature of the mistake these people are making. So, for example, we will notice about the Rafida that they have a revolutionary spirit. They are revolutionary. We will find this amongst them, that they will always be contending with the Sunni leadership and rulership, and they have a revolutionary spirit amongst them. And what drives that spirit? What are the misconceptions? What are the innovations? What are the lies, right? And similarly with the Khawarij, we will find that they are putting the wrong labels on people. This leads to extremism. And conversely, the Murji'ah, they are weakening the religion because they are putting lofty labels, the wrong labels, upon sinful, disobedient people, and they are making light of the religion, right? So the point being that when we write in these books, we are wanting to know all of these things. We want to know the names of the men. We want to know the issues, the central, what is the issue of dispute? What is the issue of the religion that the innovation centers around? We want to know, okay, what were the evidences? How did they fall into misinterpretation? What gave rise to them? What was the occurrence? What was the historical event? And what are the effects, right? So in other words, each book that you now have for the Khawarij, Rafida, Qadariya, Murji'a, you are putting all of this information in there. So really what I'm saying here would be that the way you are studying is a bit like, let me give you a similitude. If you imagine there is on a motorway, there is a careless driver, and this driver is the cause of an accident, and then there's a big pile up, and there's a wreck on the motorway. So what happens is, along come the ambulance and the police, and so then you have cameras and you have eyewitnesses, everybody gives their testimony, and all of that information is gathered. And so what happens now is that there's a forensic analysis to figure out what actually happened, what actually took place, how did it start, right? What why and how did this happen? Whose fault was it? And what are its consequences? Right? So it's like a forensic analysis. You are building that picture over time by gathering all the information. And it's exactly the same thing here. You do the same thing. But obviously in this case, like I said to you, you don't just sit there and in a week, all of a sudden, you've acquired everything there is to know of the first 7 centuries or the whole history of Islam even. It doesn't work like this. You do it over time, and you've got to have a plan in which to build that knowledge over time gradually. So we've spoke about the first century. We mentioned the Khawarij, Rafida, Qadariya, Murji'a. And so very quickly to give a quick example, let's take the Khawarij for example. So obviously we already know Dhul Khuwaysira at-Tamimi, the seeds of that discontent in the time of the Messenger of Allah ﷺ and the group of people with him. And then what happens is, in the time of Uthman radiallahu anhu, the same group of people appear and start to speaking and making people go against Uthman and hate him and create a revolution leading to his eventual death and his assassination. And then the same elements basically then conspire to create more tribulation until they arrive in the time of Ali and Muawiyah as a distinct group, and they break off. And so all of that we know, obviously. And then after that, we find that they've split into sects. So there's an individual called Nafi' bin al-Azraq. Nafi' bin al-Azraq. And this was a very extreme person, a barbarian, who his views were so extreme that he declared that anyone who didn't agree with his view to be a mushrik, and the children of mushriks, and that they could be killed, and that even if his own followers who were upon his view, even if they were upon his view and yet they didn't come and join him, they were residing in among the Muslims they considered to be disbelievers, even he would consider to be disbelievers, right? So we know that they split into the Azariqa, and then there was another group of the Khawarij, and when they saw the extremity of the Azariqa, they split away and they became known as the Najadat. And this was on the basis of a man called Najda bin Amir. Right, so he rejected some of the extremism of the Azariqa, and so he had his own group, and he had his particular views. He has, had his particular statements, and then after them there was another group, right? Let's say the Ibadiyya, and the Ibadiyya, this is like a more moderate group, and they are not as extreme. They basically hold similar views, but they say that we can live and we can live alongside the people who don't hold our view. We consider them to be disbelievers, but we can marry them and we can interact with them, and so on and so forth. So the point being is that we, as we build our knowledge, we also build our knowledge of the individual, like the sects and the groups, that they in turn split into, and the various views they differed in. We are gradually building that knowledge over time. So this is the Khawarij. The same thing would be with the Qadariyah, the same thing with the Rafida, the same thing with the Murji'ah. Many different sects that split amongst the Murji'ah. They had many statements. So basically we are building up that knowledge over time, and we're having a separate book for each of these groups. Now we move into the 2nd century up to the centuries which followed, and obviously now we start looking at a number of developments that take place, right? So now you would have a separate book on the people of Kalam, Ahlul Kalam, Ahlul Kalam. And among the Ahlul Kalam, there are many groups. The Jahmiyyah, they're the beginning, at the beginning of the 2nd century. Then the Mu'tazila, and then the Hishamiyya. These are the Rafida. And they fell into something of Ilmul Kalam as well. And they fell into Tajseem and Tashbih. Right? So this is a Hishamiyya. These are in the 2nd century. The Jahmiyyah around 100 Hijrah, 110 Hijrah. The Mu'tazila roughly about, again, similar time period, 110, 120 Hijrah. The Hishamiyya around 170, 180 Hijrah. The Kullabiyya around 230 Hijrah in the time of Imam Ahmad. The Karramiyya, these are like Hanafis, fell into Ilmul Kalam. And they also fell into something of, Tashbih as well. 250 Hijrah after Imam Ahmad. Then we have the Ash'ariyya, about 330, 40 Hijrah in the 4th century. And the Maturidiyya, again, roughly in the 4th century, about 320, 330, 340, they start developing. So all of this now is a separate block. The first block was the 4 usul, the 4 foundations. Khawarij, Rafida, Murji'ah, Qadariyah. That's the first block. The second block is in the 2nd century all the way to the 4th and the 5th century. And these are the people of Kalam, people of Ilmul Kalam. And so what they've done, we need to understand what the issue is with these groups. What these groups have done is that they've looked at the Christians, they've looked at the Sabi'ah, and they've looked at Greek philosophy, and they've tried to incorporate some of the arguments that these nations were using to prove Allah's existence, and they incorporated some of these ideas and these arguments. And so these arguments, when they tried to use them, it forced them to deny the names and attributes and actions of Allah Azza wa Jal. And then they fell into dispute amongst each other with respect to what can we affirm and what can we deny for Allah Azza wa Jal of the names and attributes. So then they differed amongst themselves. The Jahmiyyah denied everything. The Mu'tazila denied everything but the names. Then the Kullabiyya, Ash'ariyya, Maturidiyya, they affirmed the names, they affirmed some of the attributes, but they denied the chosen actions of Allah Azza wa Jal. And they had different approaches. So here now you would have a separate book, and you, in this book, a slightly larger book, maybe twice the size, because there's many sects here and many groups, and you would obviously need to build and revise your knowledge. And again, the same thing. What are the names of the individuals? What were the actual issues unique to each one of them? How did they misinterpret the evidences? And what are the effects of these innovations upon the hearts and the minds of people? So this now is a second major area that has to be looked at, the people of Kalam, Ahlul Kalam. And that's an entire, it covers the sifat, the attributes of Allah Azza wa Jal, the names and the attributes. So this is what the whole thing focuses around. They made a mistake in the issue of the attributes, and in terms of rational evidences, Instead of sticking to the rational evidences of the Quran, they entered foreign things, innovated things, dubious things, speculative things, and they entered the baggage of previous nations. And obviously that's going to have an impact. Now the next thing, so this is the second main block, right? This is a block. You put everything into a block. So now this is the block of the people of Kalam. Now the third block is kind of two, let's say, the third block is tasawwuf. Tasawwuf meaning the roots of Sufism and the extreme Sufism, right? And we have to also understand that some of the major deviations that happened in the later centuries, in the 6th and 7th centuries, what they did was to combine some of the innovations of the earlier centuries, right? So when we come to the extreme Sufis, for example, we find that they combine between the bid'ah of the, some of the groups of the Qadariyah and the bid'ah of the Tasawwuf and some aspects of the Batiniyah, right? These secretive esoteric groups, right? So as we build this picture, we'll come to realize that some of these later, more extreme groups, what they've done is they've combined and merged the ideas and the doctrines of some of the earlier groups. So we now come to the third block, and so this would be tasawwuf, which is this asceticism, and this starts in the East, right? So when we go towards the East, when we go to Iraq, in Basra, and then we go towards Afghanistan and those places, what is modern day Afghanistan, towards Khorasan, we find that in those places there used to be the Buddhists and the Hindus and people like that. And so some of this, the notion of spirituality and asceticism, it started coming from that direction. And it began as something very small, asceticism, and then it began to build and it began to incorporate other things, other innovations, until it became what it became, of Sufism, and then it comprised many, many things. So here now you would have a separate book, and you would call this Tasawwuf stroke Sufism, right? And so here you are dealing innovations in worship, exaggeration in zuhud, and a focus on basically going beyond the bounds, right? So you need to know the names, and it's something that evolved over time. And so again, the same thing, as and when you come across information, you go back, you make a mental note of it, or you write it down, and then you come back to this book and you put it into this book. So this now is Tasawwuf begins to appear in the early 2nd century of Islam. And so after this block, we now move into the block of at this point we can mention the Batiniyah, right? So this is now a separate block, the Batiniyah. Now the Batiniyah, these are movements which are basically trying to merge between Islam and philosophy and some aspects of Shiism. And the Batiniyah, these groups, Batiniyah, it means that they believe there's something hidden, there's some secret knowledge, there are some secret interpretations of the Quran. This actually began very early with the followers of Abdullah bin Saba. Abdullah bin Saba al-Yahudi, his followers, they began to say, the early group of the Saba'iyyah, they began to say that every verse has 7 hidden meanings. And then they said 70, and then they said 700, and then they said 7,000. So the Quran now is full of hidden secret meanings. These ideas began to occur right at the very beginning, starting with the Sab'iyya, which is basically in the 1st century, during the time of Uthman and Ali radiallahu, during the time of Ali radiallahu anhu. And so over time it began to grow, and so this sowed the seeds of the Batini movements. The Batini movements meaning the secretive movements, and who are basically, they have political objectives and they want to merge the Quran with the worldly sciences and with philosophy, and they also want they show the face of Shiism. And so it, over the centuries, after the 2nd century, 3rd century, it really began to take shape in around the 4th century, right? So we're talking about 300s. At the end of the 3rd century and at the early 4th century, right? So we have the Qaramita. The Qaramita are these, Batini movement, and they attacked Mecca. They took the Black Stone and they kept it for many, many years, around 319, 339 Hijrah, in that area. And they became strong, and they eventually created a number of states in the middle of the Muslim empire, right? So in North Africa, in Egypt, they established a state there, the Ubaydiyya. And then we have in Bahrain, these Qaramita, and likewise in northern Iran, there was another state there as well. So this whole group and this whole movement, it is very useful for us to study them, because through that we are able to understand the ways and techniques and methods of the people of hypocrisy, the people of nifaq, the people who enter into Islam out of hypocrisy, and who have these movements. They want to distort the Islamic sciences. They want to corrupt the Islamic sciences. They want to merge the speculative knowledge that they have of the world, the speculative sciences, and they want to merge them with the Quran, right? This is now a whole separate block of study, and there are many books which were written, alhamdulillah, by the Muslim scholars. Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah has many discussions about these people as well. And so that now is a separate block that would have to be studied. The Batini movements, who the men were, who the individuals were, and what their activities were, and what the ideas were that they wanted to introduce, and so on and so forth. So again, as and when you come across this information, you have a separate book now, which you label Batini movements. And as and when you come across this knowledge over the years, and as time progresses, you put that knowledge, you put it in that book. So this is the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th block. We have another block, and so this block now is the block of the philosophers, the falasifa, right? Because they were a significant movement in early Islamic history, and they were debating with the people of Kalam. So there was a battle between the people of philosophy, the falasifa, and the people of Kalam. So here now you'd have a separate book, and that book you would put on it the falasifa or the mutafalsifa, like the pseudo philosophers, those who try to be like the Greek philosophers. So some of the names, for example, Ya'qub al-Kindi, he died in the year 252 Hijrah. Al-Farabi, 339 Hijrah. Ibn Sina, 429 Hijrah, right? So he was from the Batinis as well, right? So this group of people now, they represent a faction which we call the mutafalsifa, like the pseudo-philosophers, and they were debating with the people of Kalam, right? So your Ash'aris and Maturidis and people like that. Now what these guys are basically trying to say is that, the universe is eternal, there is no such thing as creation, there is, there is no such thing as prophethood. Anyone can become a prophet, right? It's just some skills you've got to acquire, right? So they were saying these things on the basis of what they inherited of Greek philosophy and the ideas, many of the ideas of the Greeks. So unless you understand these people, you will not really understand a lot of the issues to do with the people of Kalam, right? The Ahlul Kalam. Because the issues of Ahlul Kalam are intertwined with the issues with the people of philosophy, the Falasifa, right? So this now is a separate block, the Falasifa, right? So you need to have a separate book, and in that book you are going to, again, build your knowledge. Who are the key people? Also, we can add, in fact, Ibn Rushd. He was also amongst the people who had this particular inclination. So you put him in that group as well. And so over time you build that knowledge. So here we can see we have like a separate block. We treat it as a block. And in this we would understand, it will help us to understand the arguments between Ahlul Kalam and the Falasifa. And then also, how do we as people of the Sunnah, how do we then look at the arguments between these two blocks, right? Right. So unless we understand all of this, then in turn we ourselves will not be able to understand the refutation against all of these people, and we will not really grasp many of the writings of Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah and Ibn al-Qayyim and the scholars who really came and they basically dealt with all of these groups, and they spoke of their statements and their sayings with detail. So we need to have a clear we need to separate all these groups out into these blocks, and we need to know what each block is about and what innovations and ideas pertain to each block, and we build our knowledge over time. And as we do this over time, then we'll find that as we read, for example, some of the earlier books or the books of Ibn Taymiyyah, it now starts making more sense. We now start understanding what's going on, because like I gave the example of the car crash on a motorway, where you have to forensically build a picture of what happened, then in the same way, when you are reading the books of, for example, Ibn Taymiyyah, Ibn al-Qayyim, what you are seeing is a similar forensic analysis of whatever happened in history. So unless you are clear in your mind about these various blocks and each sect in particular, then you will struggle to really read and understand some of these later books written, by these great scholars such as Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah and Ibn al-Qayyim. So this now, I believe, is the first, second, third, fourth block of the philosophers. Sorry, the fifth block, right? So we have the first one, the Khawarij, Rafida, Qadariya, Murji'ah. We treat that as the usul, right, in the first century. We have the second block of the people of Kalam, Jahmiyyah, Mu'tazila, Hishamiyya, which are Rafida, Kullabiyya, Karramiyya, Ash'ariyya, Maturidiyya. Then we have the third block, which is Tasawwuf. The fourth block are the Batini movements, the Batiniyya. And the fifth block are the Falasifa, the philosophers. Right. The sixth block are the extreme Sufis, which start appearing in the 6th and 7th centuries. These are your Ibn Arabi and people like that. And what they do is now they start combining many things. They start bringing the bid'ah of Jabr and, issues to do with the Sifat and aspects of Tasawwuf, and likewise aspects of Rafd, the Rafida, and they combine all of these things together and they come up with some really extreme, Wahdatul Wujud and Ittihad and all these very devious, heretical doctrines, right? So this now is like your extreme Sufis, where they basically abolish the Sharia, that, since Allah is everything and everything is Allah, there's no halal, there is no haram, there are no Sharia commands, no one needs to abide by any command, right? So you come to the real extreme, innovations that come, in the later period. So you now put this as the sixth block, and we'll call this the extreme people of Wahdatul Wujud, Ittihad, Hulul, extreme Sufism, abolishing the command and the prohibition, Isqatul Amr wa Nahi, abolishing. All of this really devious stuff comes later on. And so what we've done so far then is we have a historical timeline. We also have like a division into organized blocks, right? So we have the four, the usul of the innovations in the first century. Then we have the Ahlul Kalam spanning many centuries. Then we have the beginning of Tasawwuf. Then we have the Batini movements. Then we have the Falasifa. And then we have the extreme Sufis, right? You would need to have, so you have a separate book also for the Batiniya, a separate book for the Falasifa, and a separate notebook for the extreme Sufis, right? Those who came and started basically, some of them claimed prophethood, some of them claimed that being the wali and is superior to prophethood. And all these ideas, they're really messed up ideas. You obviously want to take a note of them and study them, and so you would have a separate book to deal with those issues, very severe issues. Right. So what we've done so far then, till this point is, like I said, you have to have a bird's eye view. First of all, you start from the general broad overview, then you start filling in the details. Then you start filling in the information. It's a bit like the jigsaw puzzle. If you have the picture first, you need to have the broad picture first, otherwise you can't do the puzzle, right? So when you have a 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzle, then you need to see the picture. If you don't see what the picture is, you are lost. You don't know what goes where. So you need to have the broad picture first. Then, as time goes on, you start putting the right pieces in the right place. So this is what we are doing here. What we've done so far is given, it's like as if you have a bird's eye view of, first of all, history in the first 7 centuries. Then you can see the different organized blocks, right, in the first century. Then a block of the Ahlul Kalam, then the block of Tasawwuf, and then the Falasifa, and then the Batini movements, and then you have the extreme Sufis. And obviously this is only the first 7 centuries, right? And that really is the foundation for what comes afterwards. Unless you have a grasp of all of this, because you see that the same things are being repeated. There's nothing new happening in the 21st century or the 20th century, right? It's the same old things repeating, but coming in a different garment, in a different shape, in a different appearance. So unless you have a good grasp of all of this, then, you will not really understand what comes afterwards. So what we've done so far at this point is build the overview, the bird's eye view, and this can be put like in a diagram form. It can be represented in a diagram form. In fact, I actually have a diagram here in front of me. I could make that available as an image or something at some later point. And so then it's a matter of filling in the gaps over time. Over time. This is not going to happen, in a week or in a month. It's something that's ongoing, continuous study. But you are putting the information in an organized way into the relevant book. Okay, so now I've got to quickly finish because we are entering into Maghrib and there is another lecture, and I want to, obviously I think I would need probably another hour to finish this, but what I want to very quickly do is I'm going to mention the different works, the different types of books that are available and how you would study. So we need to be aware that when it comes to the sects and the doctrines, there are 4 types of books. there are 4 types of resources which are available to us in order to engage in this study, right? So once we've set up the bird's eye view and we've set up all of our books, we've got the books, maybe how much will we need? We need 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. You need about 9 or 10 notebooks dedicated to each of these blocks and these groups. So once you've got that set up in place, then what are the source materials, right? There are 4 types of historical books which we will use. And let me explain them one by one. So the first type of book is the simple affirmation of creed. It simply mentions the creed of Ahlus Sunnah, and within there it might make mention of some of the groups, right? These are books like, for example, Usul al-Sunnah of Imam Ahmad rahimahullah, Sharh al-Sunnah, and all the various books where that they are very short, simple statements and affirmation of creed. They're not detailed, they're not lengthy, just simple statements. So like I said, there are many, many, many books which are like this. In so many different topics, Kitab al-Sunnah, Kitab al-Iman, Khalq Af'al al-Ibad of Imam al-Bukhari. How many is that? I have a list of about 70, 80 books in front of me. I could just mention many of them, starting from the time of Umar bin Abdul Aziz, rahimahullah ta'ala. The Khalifa, righteous Khalifa, he wrote a book, he wrote a Risala Ar-Rad ala al-Qadariyya, right? And I have a list of about 80 or so, in fact more than 80, of books spanning the first few centuries. And amongst them are those which are simple affirmations of creed. Al-Tahawi's creed, Usul al-Sunnah of Imam Ahmad, the book of... there are so many, I'm stuck for words to, which one to mention from the list. But anyway, you get the point, right? There are short, simple books that you begin with, and through that you get introduced to some of the ideas, some of the issues to do with the Sahaba, Qadar, the attributes of Allah, and things like that, right? So you become introduced to these topics. The second type of book now is the book that is organized in terms of subject area, and it brings many, many narrations from the Sunnah, Quranic verses and Athar from the Sahaba on a topic by topic basis. So this would be, for example, Ash-Shari'ah of Al-Jurri. He died 360 Hijrah. Ibn Battah's Al-Ibanatul Kubra, a detailed work organized into subject areas. And likewise, Al-Lalaka'i, his Sharh Usul I'tiqad, a very comprehensive book. So this now is the second category of reference or resource that we go back to in order to, increase our knowledge and find the details, and then to put them in the relevant notebook. Right, so this is now a bit more detailed, and in there you find evidences, you find refutations of the evidences of the people of bid'ah, and so on and so forth. The third type of book that we have access to are the books of rudud, the refutations, and there are very, very many. For example, Imam Ahmad's refutation, Ar-Rad ala al-Zanadika wal-Jahmiyya. Imam Ad-Darimi, rahimahullah, he wrote a book refuting Bishr al-Marisi. And then amongst the Salaf you see Kitab Risala Ar-Radd al-Qadariyya, as we saw from Umar bin Abdul Aziz, Ar-Radd al-Qadariyya of Ismail bin Hamad, Ar-Radd ala Ahl al-Ahwa of Al-Humaydi, and there are so many here. Ar-Radd ala al-Jahmiyya of Imam al-Bukhari. There's so many Ar-Radd al-Jahmiyya. So many scholars wrote a book, Ar-Radd al-Jahmiyya, Ar-Radd al-Murji'ah, Yahya bin Umar al-Kinani al-Maliki. So many. So my point being that there's a third type of book which now is refutation. So we have simple affirmation, the first category. Then we have a more detailed explanation based upon proofs, which is the second category. And the third category is now the refutations. This is where now you gain more understanding about the misinterpretation of the verses. You gain more insight. So this is the third category. And finally, the fourth category is the books that were written by many authors in which they, like an encyclopedia, and they bring all of the groups and the subdivisions of the groups, and they mention the various statements, right? So these are the books that were mainly authored by a lot of the, those from the Ash'ari, they were in that orientation. For example, Maqalat al-Islamiyyin wa Abul Hasan al-Ash'ari, it's a reference work. At-Tanbih wal-Radd by al-Malti. This is a very good book. Al-Farq Bayn al-Firaq by Abdul Qahir al-Baghdadi. Ibn Hazm has a work, Al-Fasl fi al-Milal wal-Nihal, and a similar work by Ash-Shahrastani, Al-Milal wal-Nihal. And, the books which are like that, which are reference works, which you can go back to find a bit more detail now, more kind of a detail into the statements of these groups and the subgroups and the subdivisions. So these are some of the reference works that can be referred back to. And I think I've really run out of time. It's time for Maghrib, so I'm going to have to stop here. And, there's more that can be said. But I think, inshallah, from all of this, a person should now have a good basic idea in terms of the importance of this, how it's connected to Aqidah, the way that you structure the study. It's something that you cannot do straight away. You build it up over time. The knowledge increases over time, because obviously this is a vast field in itself. And so this is something that's going to take you many, many years, decades, in fact, in order to build that knowledge over time and comprehension. And as I said, it's inseparable from the study of Aqidah. The two of them go together. And so with that, inshallah ta'ala, we'll conclude our lesson there for today. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, wa sallallahu ala nabina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'een.